In this episode of This Is a Scene, I'm taking a break from the interviews to have a short recap of the podcast so far and talk about forthcoming plans for the podcast, the revamped idea for the website, and This Is music gigs for the rest of the year. I'll also discuss the recent indie poo saga and review Keyside's debut album and talk about Garage Flower's debut single. The podcast's 4 episodes in so far, and we've had Inertia from Manchester with their spacey atmospheric rock, the False Idols from Swansea, who play a big sort of groove-based, sprawling, epic sound, Gunshy from Scotland with their classic songwriting and melodies, and most recently all the way from San Diego, Pleasure Pill, with their big guitars and big choruses. So please go back and check out the rest of the podcast interviews because it helps out the bands immensely, really. I also just wanted to talk briefly about the reasons behind the Instagram account, the gigs, and the new podcast. It all sort of started around 2017 when I felt like the classic Brit group was slowly disappearing from view. There was nobody, in my opinion, occupying the space left by the Smiths, the Stone Roses, Oasis, etc. Arctic Monkeys were sort of entering Alex Turner's egocentric sort of lounge singer phase. Kasabian were heading towards Serge's TikTok pop phase. And Blossoms, who looked promising initially for an album, sort of turned into a pop band as well, in my opinion. And I'd seen some highly promising bands like Exit Calm and the Real Society fall by the wayside, with this sort of increasingly hard in the modern landscape of music to make it. So I went searching for new bands and across whatever avenue I could, really, and researching for myself, sometimes just off a band name or even a vibe that I got from it. And I found a few, Pastel being one that I followed virtually from inception. I haven't seen just like a rehearsal on Facebook, I think, at the time. And I kind of decided these bands were up against it, really, in the way the musical landscape was changing. That was shifting towards solo artists and bands from more financially supportive backgrounds who could afford to tour regularly and do it as a full-time job. So I wanted to give some of the bands, some coverage and help them reach people who wouldn't necessarily go looking for them, as people don't really so much these days. Or if the algorithm hadn't presented it to them via their Instagram or TikTok, how I know a lot of people find music these days. So I just wanted to showcase the bands, bands who give me the same feeling, that the sort of vibe I got in the 90s. Just great songs, bands you could believe in and follow. They're keeping that tradition of there's always been in the UK sort of guitar music scene, really, the classic guitar band in all its different forms, but sharing that sort of distinctive DNA that a lot of the great British guitar groups and indie bands have had for maybe 40 odd years now. And that sort of brings me on to the recent indie poo debate, a childish classification, which I'm sure is more of a joke than an actual proper critique of the indie scene, indie genre, if indie is even a genre anymore. I feel there's a certain degree of classism in a lot of this, with many of the critiques being, for bands who've been influenced more by the sort of 90s northern working class bands being targeted, rather than anybody targeting this plethora of middle class bands currently trying to be Nirvana. I feel it's just a bit of indie snobbery that's going around as usual. I will agree, some of the Oasis copyists are getting it all wrong, in my opinion, and doing very bad impressions that are not really being convincing or having any of their own personality much in the music. Not sort of taking an influence, more sort of directly, copying But that doesn't mean that there's sort of bland indie guitar pop that's sort of currently doing well via TikTok and Instagram and getting on the festivals and that is any better just because it's more polished and maybe more musically proficient. But it comes across to me a lot as characterless, has no edge. It's watered down to all its sort of basic components for mass consumption. There's no guitar players, bassists, drummers standing out anymore. Because everything's sort of pushed out for instant gratification, all to be done in 3 minutes, and not to grab anyone's attention beyond that. I even saw a recent interview where an upcoming indie band talked about writing songs with TikTok in mind and cutting out instrumental passages to get included on Spotify playlists. And I just see it as a sad indictment of where current music is and guitar music is, and it needs to sort of seriously change, in my opinion. And music started to be treated as a sort of brainless commodity in the background, and yeah, just not being thought of in the same way that it was perhaps 20, 30 years ago. And we're just getting a lot of tech bros who are forcing musicians into a corner really to have a career. Like they feel like they have to follow this route that everybody's going to sort of make a name in the music industry and music world these days. I think there needs to be like a true alternative as there was in the 80s and 90s when labels such as Creation and Factory existed, to break the monopoly of the largely bland music industry that was being controlled by the major record companies. And without those kind of labels coming up in the 80s and 90s, we wouldn't have had a Happy Mondays, Joy Division, The Smiths, Screamadelica, My Bloody Valentine's, Loveless, Oasis even, and the hot entire shoegaze scene even. Nobody would have taken a chance on any of them, I believe, if there hadn't been independent labels. And that's been kind of taken away now. There's some very small independent labels, but they don't have the same power that these others did because they haven't got product to sell. There's no money in it. The money is being taken away from the bottom of the industry, making it sort of virtually impossible for working class or lower middle class bands to make an impact because nobody's going to take the chance to sign them. There's nobody's developing artists anymore, certainly not bands. REM took 6 albums to get anywhere really and break into what was the mainstream at the time. And I can't see anybody getting the opportunity really in 6 years unless they've got somebody funding them, or 6 albums even, not 6 years, it was probably more than 6 years, without people funding them. And that's just not going to happen. Like the majority of working class bands probably have a limited time to make it before the fact you have to balance jobs, you have to do all these things to try and get your band around the country, tour around your job, because people aren't investing in that area of the industry as much anymore, or virtually not at all, unless there's a complete guarantee that it's gonna do well. So nobody gets a real chance to develop. And I think that's a major problem going forward. I think in the past, like indie bands were able to share the national stage weekly with really terrible pop acts in the top 40. You could get on top of the pops. There hasn't been a band at the top of the charts for many, many years now. Bands can get an album maybe in the top 10 if they can generate enough physical sales, but it's normally for a week, the initial week, and there's no longevity beyond that for people. The albums, they just don't have a longer shelf life. I mean, they have a long shelf life on streaming, but then it's just that particular audience who's found it. There's not many ways for them to get that further out because they haven't got the backing of a major label who will continue to promote that, or any label who can really promote that for a genuine long period of time and give it the sort of attention it needs. So that's, streaming has taken that money out of the bottom of the industry, meaning that, yeah, everything has to almost be a certainty now before anybody's prepared to put any money in it, because there isn't really any money in the industry. It's very much a very small group of people at the very top who can afford to do it as a living and make genuine money out of it, because we know, streaming is not funneling any money towards these bands. So I mean, they really do have to rely on live gigs, and that's another thing where being playing live, to get around the country, it takes a lot of money, and that just probably isn't there for the majority of people. Most of the bands are expected to do the majority of the work for the record labels these days, be it promoting themselves online, getting the numbers up to even to get a chance to be signed, and then they're expected to do all the legwork for these labels if they even consider signing them. We've all heard about you have to have 50,000 followers on TikTok at least, and some people haven't got the time or the inclination to do that, to make a TikTok. And TikToks for me is like it isn't even showing a genuine character of the band quite often, because they're having to do the same as what most other bands are putting out to even get somehow into the algorithm or something in it. They're not even getting to show their own personality, which was probably why a lot of this indie poo stuff has come along as well, because it's what people are seeing, it's what people are catching, and it's not giving you a reason why you would have really liked a band in the past. They had much more of their own personality, be it through the music press. The Stone Roses were notorious for being difficult in interviews and keeping a bit of mystique, and that would almost be impossible, I think, in this day and age if you're going to make it. So it's kind of pushing everybody down the same very small funnel, which they shouldn't all have to be in. But alternative music was to be the alternative, and it doesn't really feel quite like that at the moment. What I will say is the indie poo saga and debate is a result of there no longer being a critical music press, and young bands are sort of throwing themselves out there far too early to be criticised, because they're chasing these TikTok numbers, seeing it as a quick route to fame. A lot of bands I've seen have started doing it who weren't initially doing it because they've seen other artists suddenly pick up maybe, these big numbers of followers on TikTok and Instagram, and then that suddenly awakens probably booking agents and management more than record labels really these days, because like I say, they don't exist in any way in the same way as they did. So this is getting them maybe booked onto festivals because people are just seeing the followers, and it's not like any show of how much better they are than anyone. They've just been prepared to actually put the time and effort into making TikToks, and that doesn't show the quality of the music. And that's certainly what's been, I think, attracting a lot of people to come out against certain groups and call them indie poo, because they've been putting themselves out there, and perhaps they're not the most proficient or talented bunch of people. And if you put yourself out there on these platforms now, you're going to get criticism. In the past, it would have been the music press, and it might have been slightly more constructive, but still would have been probably highly critical in cases. And I think people also aren't used to that anymore, because we just get sort of sycophantic influencers who've been asked to promote bands, and lots of blog pieces where they're just writing about their friends or the bands they've been approached to write about, and they're just putting out the press release essentially. so there isn't really a critical music press now. So it's allowing a lot of stuff to get through that probably wouldn't have got through, and also it's also allowing a lot of trolling now because that's the way people show what they think of things, and they're much more able to do so. So it has a negative effect, really. And I think chasing these TikTok numbers and that is, it seems like a quick route to success, and some bands have come through very quickly and have, started touring and doing these sort of sellout tours, even if they're fairly small venues. But I think it's going to lead to an even quicker crash. And obviously, a lot of them aren't really ready for that level of attention at the moment. But they feel they need to do it because the market's so saturated now, because there's so many songs released and music released every day, and there isn't a alternative route that used to be offered by the music press. You could reach large numbers just by getting a small article in one of the weeklies each week, and you would push yourself into the national consciousness. But that mono culture no longer really exists. So we're getting a lot of quantity over quality, because there's no critical music press, because there's no genuine proper indie labels who can and put out a product. So you would be getting the best of the best, hopefully at that point, that were being signed by people, and it would certainly filter out a lot of these bands currently around probably wouldn't have had a record out. So, there is the good thing that people say, that people can certainly get their music out a lot easier than they could have done. But then, of course, you're going to get absolutely anything out there. And it's also causing a mass saturation, and making it harder for a lot of bands to get through that, because people have got to somehow try and find them amongst everything else that is out there currently. Anyway, that's enough of the negatives. The purpose of my gigs and the podcast in a small way is to sort of counteract these things that I've been talking about. And, it's refreshing anyway to see people discussing guitar music again, and, people wanting more of it and better quality stuff as well. A critical conversation about music is never a bad thing. And hopefully the industry will address some of the sort of genuine issues that, I've mentioned in this, and which I think is, causing a problem for bands, a problem for music in general, to reach people. You're seeing small venues closing all the time now, so clearly people aren't going out to gigs as much as they were. There's been a drop off in seeing any sort of guitar bands or young bands even on mainstream TV, which would push them to an audience that they're not getting to, like, openly on things on YouTube. It's out there, but unless it gets pushed out to everyone and somehow gets an algorithm, it keeps a very small niche audience. And I think it needs to be that it's, some of these bands are, pushed towards a bigger national audience to sort of change the whole sort of landscape of music at the moment, away from what has become very, very pop orientated. And, a guitar band now seems like quite a revolutionary thing to even be anywhere near the top of the charts, if the charts matter anymore. But I think they do, in terms of, like, if you're going to make money from this and make a living from this, you clearly have to be, hitting these bigger numbers and reaching a bigger audience. Now, to talk about what the sort of plans are for the Feelin Supersonic website, which is sort of laid dormant for a few months now, and I admittedly haven't got around to doing much with it. The idea, I think, is to sort of go back over some of the lesser known bands of the 80s, 90s, and a little bit beyond that. Bands, I think, that have sort of largely been forgotten, but convey the sort of feeling that I'm looking for, even in the new artists and on my This Is Music page. And maybe make some mixes of this sort of music because I still listen to it and I think some of it's great, and it would be great to get it out there, and maybe people will discover some forgotten tunes that they really like and might investigate. So that will probably be more of that happening on the website, and I'll keep the newer band stuff on the Instagram and podcast and keep trying to push them along on that. The new Music Mondays will continue on Insta as well. Do that as often as I can, and there'll be more This Is Music gigs in Norwich for the rest of the year. Got Happy Neighbours coming up on September the 4th, supported by Gunshy and Red Afternoon in the State. That's all for £4. The link will be in the bio. I mean, that's an absolute steal, really. And hopefully people will come out and start supporting those gigs more regularly and supporting these bands so they can carry on. I mean, the plan is to maybe have another one in October and another one in November, and then hopefully carry on in the new year if the demand's there. Just wanted to end this brief podcast episode with a mention of a couple of releases that have come out recently. Keyside from Liverpool finally got around to releasing their debut album, eponymous debut album. The majority of the tracks have been available online through EPs and that on Spotify over the past couple of years. I've covered them on my Insta as well. They're a band who I've been following from when they were even Keyside Cassidy and had a single out called Lights Out, which is probably long forgotten now. I've also tried to get them down to Norwich about 3 years ago. The album is, it's a pretty instant, 12 songs in under 40 minutes. The classic sort of chiming guitars. The singer Dan Parker's got a very kitchen sink drama style lyrics, a bit of social reality in there, which is, is very different in this day and age, and actually you don't see that a lot in the current sort of indie bands that are around at the moment. It's got that feel of the Lars, that's being from Liverpool. There's a couple of tracks that are very Lars-ish, but there's a lot of Smiths in there as well. Jangly, rootsy. The singer's got a very good soulful voice, and there's some real sort of infectious airworm melodies in there. Each song sort of catches the attention pretty quickly, and I think it's definitely worth giving a listen. It's it's proper songs, proper classic songwriting, and hopefully needs to keep being encouraged, really. And finally, just mention Garage Flower, who's released their debut single called Garage Flower the past week. They've been targeted recently in a lot of the online hate, part of this sort of indie poo nonsense that's going around. People seem to love them or hate them, but you have to remember that Oasis were and still are a hugely diverse band, and I feel Garage Flower just had some attitude, and that sort of upsets the very beige middle class crowd, which is no bad thing either. I think it's nice to see a little bit of attitude in music, and a little bit of honesty in interviews as well. And I've met them, and they've come down and played for me, and they can definitely play. And for their age and relative inexperience, the single was definitely a promising start. People aiming sort of Stone Roses barbs at them, and I just have to say John Squire is no slouch in the guitar department, and Dylan, who plays guitar for Garage Flower, is better than most people I've seen. He's got a real natural flair about it, and they can properly jam out, and they've got a bit of groove in their music, which is also distinctly missing, I feel, in a lot of what I call the very beige indie groups who are hanging around at the moment at the top. So it's nice to see a bit of grit, bit of groove, bit of attitude in guitar music again. And I would just say, don't make the opinions on a few TikToks you've scene. Just listen beyond 15 seconds and you might find that they're certainly not in any way poo compared to a lot of stuff that I see getting, bigged up online at the moment, which I don't think has half as much character or, personality or anything in it really. So, yeah, definitely give that a listen and give them a chance, I'd say. And just to say, that's it for now. Keep your eyes out for the forthcoming This Is the Scene episodes. We've got Skull coming on, Happy Neighbours, and a few other groups all lined up. So there'll definitely be episodes out in towards the end of September, and then hopefully for the rest of the year. So I'll catch you back then. Thanks for listening.